Hello, folks. Hello, everyone.
Okay, we are going to say good afternoon to everyone. Welcome to the Township of Douro-Dummer's special meeting here on this Friday afternoon. And before we do get underway, I remind everyone that it is being broadcast live on YouTube and also will be recorded for anyone wanting to watch it. I'll call the roll so people know who's here and who isn't here. Of members of council, first of all, Deputy Mayor Moher.
Here.
Councillor Watt. Councillor Landsman. And Councillor Watson. Okay, we have all our council is present. We can call the meeting to order. Also joining us is our temporary CAO and Deputy Clerk, Martina, big wave, and also our Chief Building Official, and that is Brian. There's a big wave from him as well. Okay, with all the bodies present, the only reason that we are conducting this meeting is for a review and a discussion about the building permit fees review. No other subject will be discussed. And just for the benefit of everyone, and we thank you for your cooperation, members of council have at our request submitted all their questions about the report. So we trust there will be no need for any others. And Brian is here and he's going to give us a whole background information on the situation, and he's going to answer all the questions that have been submitted. So I think we can have a very efficient meeting and get out of here in fairly good time. Again, that is the only subject we're dealing with today. So Brian Fawcett, our Chief Building Official, you have received all the questions, and I'm going to turn it over to you, Brian, for a total recap of the situation.
Thank you, Your Worship. So I'll go through this report briefly, very briefly today. We're going to return this matter on the November 17th council meeting, at which point I'll go through this report again for the benefit of the gallery, and the comments that come out of today's discussions will factor into that edited report that goes up on the 17th. So just a bit of an overview about what we're doing here today is every year we look at our fees for the building department revenue, our user charges, what we charge people for building permits, and we allocate those fees based on the anticipated costs to administer and enforce the Building Code Act. So that's the verbiage right out of the Act. It says that we're allowed to do that, basically, that we're allowed to collect fees for building permits. The past direction of council, and I assume the future direction of council, is that the department aim for cost recovery. So we look at setting our fees so that we are recovering this cost for all the services that we're providing, so that the net outcome at the end of the year ideally is a slight surplus or neutral amount to cover all of those costs, and then there's no burden on the tax base. It's just paid for by the users of the services themselves. Historically, we issue about 139 permits over the last 5 years on average each year. The number has gone up in the last few years. We'll probably see a bit of a dip this year due to COVID, but hopefully those numbers will bounce back over the next 2 years. And we're looking at steady growth in the future as well, with a few new subdivisions that may potentially come online and things like that. So just going over some budget review, I'll try not to get too hammered down on numbers, but the 2020 allocated budget is about $221,000 plus $93,000 for the sewage department. I'm not going to talk about the sewage department today because it is a separate department. Although it operates all under the same umbrella, it is actually now a separated department with its own expenses, its own revenue, and it actually operates totally on its own, and it cost recovers itself quite well, so it can be sort of left aside. So if we just look at the building department, those expenses budgeted is $221,000. Plus, there is on the revenue side of things, we're looking at last year, our revenue for both departments combined was $339,000. Septic department for last year was a bit wonky because of the transition period. So it's a bit hard to know exactly where we would have been without it. And there also wasn't the reinspection program, which does add to our revenue this year. And Lakefield College School also submitted a quite significant permit last year, which boosted our revenues. So sort of the rationale behind why we're talking about this today is that we're looking at updating our fees, which we do every year. Usually it's on an inflationary basis based on the consumer price index, which this year would be, if we were to just present a normal report with a normal year, would be a 1.2% increase that we'd be looking for, just to cover cost of inflation. But obviously this year I'm proposing that we do it a little bit differently because we have some technical challenges from a customer service perspective that make it very difficult for us to continue on collecting fees the way that we're currently collecting them. So what I mean by that is the way we currently collect fees is that it's based on the square footage of the building. If you take a house, for example, there's an administrative charge that gets charged plus a cost per square foot charge. Decks are billed separately and garages and all that sort of stuff. But if you just look at the base house, we calculate the square footage of all the finished space, gross building area, so outside wall to outside wall, and then multiply it by this number. The challenge with that is that it makes it very difficult for a layperson to look at their set of plans and start calculating percentages or dollar figures based on their square footages. So because it's so complicated and the number of errors induced by the applicant are so high, we've taken past practice, and this carried on long before I was here, is that we don't actually collect permit fees prior to somebody submitting a building permit application. We do all the work, we do the review, we do the plans review, we do all the edits and all that sort of stuff that we've done in advance, and then we tell them what the bill is at the end. Theoretically, they could walk away from that. Luckily, we're in a good spot where that very rarely happens, but it has happened in occasion in the past. So what I'm proposing is that we calculate our fees using a much more simpler method, which is just the value of construction. So everyone has an idea of what the value of construction of their project is going to be. They set a budget, a household budget for their project. And if they don't, they get prices from contractors. Contractors come in, they get a couple prices. They've got an idea of what this thing is going to cost them. It may not be 100% true to the end result, but the point is that it's an estimated construction value before you start, based on material prices at current rates and average labor costs based on the going rate. Just because you've got a buddy that you're going to piece it all together, and you've got a bunch of buddies and you're calling in a bunch of favors, that doesn't really factor into it. It is actually the calculated market rates. So those are numbers that are provided to StatsCan. We provide those numbers every year. All the municipalities have to. So we get these figures of what calculates out to how much does it actually cost to build things based on the square footage, because we also report square footage. So there's a technical manual in the industry. It's called the RS Means Data Book. We purchased a copy of the 2020 RS Means for residential construction. It's got tables and tables of data spitting out numbers of what it costs on average to build these things based on a low level, a medium level, a high level, and a custom level of construction. It's really designed for estimators and construction companies to calculate what they should be charging for their construction based on the level of finishes and that sort of thing. So we went to the lowest level because we don't want to be, even though most of the houses in our township are built to a much higher standard than this estimating book would be, we went to the lower standard so that it was as fair as possible. And those rates, we come up with all sorts of different numbers based on dwellings, garages, decks, basements, covered porches, and that sort of thing. So the number, once I did that, I went through and calculated what our costs to run the department are based on an hour. So we took the total budget, took the total number of hours that we work in a year, less training and vacation and that sort of thing, to come up with the actual physical hours, divided those numbers out, and we come up with $120 an hour. So basically everything we do needs to be recovered at a rate of $120 an hour. And I presented the same number last year. It hasn't changed. Then I took a breakdown of about 26, 27 different types of permits, all the different things that are in those categories, and how much time it takes to do each permit application, coming up with a total number, then multiplying that by the $120, you come up with this total cost. If you look at that number, it's going to show a lot of disparity, because decks, for instance, can be quite time consumptive, but they're not a very big liability as compared to a large commercial or industrial building or school or something like that. So it doesn't make sense that you would bill those all at the same dollar value if you were going to do it that way. So we introduced what's called a liability factor, which basically reduces those numbers to come up with a modified average cost. So we would show that the deck, for instance, should be much, much, much lower, as opposed to calculating out at about $2,000. It really should be about $200. So, and then when we look at things like commercial buildings, although, you know, a commercial building may take as much time as a house, or maybe just a little bit more, the permit fee for a commercial building should be much higher because the value is much higher. So where I'm going with this is that all of those modified costs based on liability factor, they actually correlate to the estimated construction value, which is quite convenient for us because that's something that we have to already collect from everyone. It's basically the first box you have to fill in after you fill out the township of Douro-Dummer on the permit application is construction value and then size. Those are the two numbers that we collect for StatsCan. So utilizing that dollar value of estimated construction costs, we're able to multiply that by a rate, which I'm proposing one of two rates, either $13.18 per $1,000 or $14.50. The reason for the difference is that extra $1.22 is, or $1.12, I guess it would be, is for an allocation to reserve funds, which I'll talk about in a moment. The $13.18 is just a little bit higher than what we charge right now for certain projects that do get charged based on the value, which is commercial projects and interior alterations without defined area. So an interior alteration without a defined area would be something like somebody's taking out a beam in a house or a load-bearing wall and installing a beam. There's no real area for that because they haven't added area, but there's still construction going on. There's still value there. So we look at these numbers. If we were to look at a 1.2% increase to our permit fees this year, we'd be looking at a proposed rate of $13.29. Because of the way that we're proposing to change this to all of them be calculated based on a dollar value, we can actually reduce that rate a little bit because there's going to be some more money come in from some of those categories than others. And we'll see a reduction in some categories. We'll see an increase in some categories that will average it all out. So I think the number should be okay at about $13.18. That's based on the math, based on calculating that we need about $21.2 million in construction value total between all the projects in the township. If you multiply that by the $13.18, then you come up with the required amount of revenue coming in based on the budget that we have set. I did provide a sample breakdown, just an illustrative amount. It's not indicative necessarily of what we get in any given year, but just kind of gives you an example and a feel for where we're coming from. One thing I do want to touch on is farm properties. Being a rural community with a lot of family-owned operated farms, billing them at the full rate is very expensive and not something that we currently do now anyway. So I wanted to continue that tradition on. So we actually took about a 25% or 75% subsidy. So they charge 25% of the rate. So that's why when you look at the fee breakdown chart that I provided, they're all $14.50 with the exception of farm buildings at $3.63. And then we have increased the minimum permit fees on certain things by about $7, which again would just sort of be an inflationary increase, and that gives us a nice round number to work from. modified a few things that I've had issues with, such as demolition of multiple buildings. It didn't really seem fair to me to charge the full rate when you're looking at 3 buildings coming down on one site. So we've reduced that rate a little bit to just $200 per building, as opposed to building out at the $214 that we charge now. I think there was a question about change of use. A change of use with no construction is where you change from one occupancy type to another. So say you go from like a retail store to an office. There isn't necessarily any construction going on there, but it is a change of the use type. So it requires a building permit under the building code. Moving on, the other thing that I've added in the permit fee schedule this year is fees for orders. We don't currently have a cost recovery method for orders. So anybody who gets an order to comply, which we don't issue very many of them, unsafe building orders. I had to list all the orders that are there. There's 6 of them in total, but usually we just stick to the order to comply, stop work order, unsafe building order, sort of depending on the circumstances of the project. We've got some cost recovery in there based on, again, the time it takes to do those orders. Like an unsafe building order can be quite time consumptive, so that's why we've charged $675 for that. I also gave you the breakdowns of what the RS mean data is. So a 1-story dwelling, we're looking at $177 a square foot. Most people, if you talk to most people that are building homes, a basic home, they would quote average number right now is about $200 a square foot. So we're looking at a lower rate than what the sort of average is right now. But again, as I explained earlier, it's based on those lower construction levels because we want to be fair to make sure that we're not overcharging the lower quality of build. Because again, the building code is sort of a minimum maintenance document. It's not your custom build document. So we want to look at that minimum and charge reflective to that. And because we don't have a lot of commercial work, I sort of just stuck with the same rationale from before, which was just a straight dollar figure. And I stuck with the same rate. There really is, we could have gone into more depth on that, but it's not worth picking up a copy of RS means for commercial or industrial construction because we just don't have the data. We don't have the project, sorry. So we looked at, basically there'd be some writing into the building bylaw that will allow for us to request copies of the tender document to verify that those fees. So say they say, we're going to build a new retail store. It's only going to cost us $20,000. Well, we know that's not true. So we would ask to see the tenders or see some copies of construction documents and that sort of thing to verify those fees. And all that language will be in the building bylaw, which again will be provided on the November meeting. Going through the fee scenarios, there is a bit of a discrepancy. I think earlier in the report, I said an 1,800 square foot house would cost X amount. And then in this fee scenario number 1, I presented again an 1,800 square foot house. The reason why there's a difference in the fees is that the one in the fee scenario has add-ons, decks and porches and a garage, whereas the one in the paragraph, I should have used a different number entirely so that it didn't cause confusion. But I think that was Sheila's question. That was the reason for that, was that the numbers are different because it had the one in the fee scenario has some add-ons. So if we look at the fee scenarios, charging the rate of $13.18, we'd be looking at a permit fee of $5,931. Based on the current fee schedule, what we would be charging would be $5,400. If you added 1.2% to that, then you'd be up a little bit closer, because again, we're comparing sort of an orange to an apple in a sense that we're comparing a 2021 rate to a 2020 rate, but trying to make them close to each other. So there is going to be a bit of a discrepancy that the new rate should be higher than the old rate, but I didn't want to make it excessively higher. But the reason that it is higher is because we're looking at what we charge right now for dwellings and that sort of thing is actually much lower than what our neighbor municipalities are charging. So we're missing out on a bit of revenue there. But then when we go to decks, for instance, we overcharge right now on decks compared to other municipalities. So our permit fee for the deck, given in the scenario, would be $444. based on 70 cents a square foot, which again, of course, would go up in 2021 rates. But we'd be looking at, under this new calculation, we'd be looking at $145 for the permit fee for that. At the $14.50, or it'd be $131.80 at the $13.18 rate. And then there was a medical center provided as a third example, just to give you a public institution commercial type project. There's no forecasting of that type of project to come to fruition or anything like that. It's just an example. And again, those numbers working out to roughly the same, looking at about $118,000, whether it was this year or next year, based on calculating it just on the difference of the rates. So I've provided that sort of summary, and then I gave some information there based on that. Some of the questions I'm just going to run through, just anything that I didn't touch on. So I'll speak to Councillor Watts. Yes, please. Sorry, 1 second. Thank you. Just give me a 5-second break here. Okay. Speaking to Councillor Watt's question, the question being that would an 1,800 square foot house in the village with a retail cost of $500,000 compared to a house on Stoney, same size but worth $1.5 million, how would the permit cost get evaluated? You have to look at you can't look at the cost of the land. You have to look at the value of the construction. So if it is literally the exact same house on the exact same size, everything else, and say it's $500,000 to build the house anywhere in the township, then it's going to be the same rate. It doesn't matter where it's located. But if they all of a sudden put in a ton of extra money into this house on Stoney, which is typically the case, then yes, the permit fee would cost more based on that higher construction value, but that's going to be a reported construction value. If we knew the size of the building, we would calculate the square footage and come up with what the minimum would be if they were reporting or self-reporting a much lower value, and that sort of thing. So that sort of jumps into, I believe it was Deputy Mayor Mower's question about calculating permit fees. We don't always have to calculate them. A lot of times you'll get a permit application. I've got a good gut feel of knowing what the value of construction is based on the size of the building. You're going to know if it's relatively close or whether it needs further evaluation. So I would say of them all, maybe we're looking at calculating about half of them, maybe less, especially for some smaller projects and things like that. If somebody says it's going to cost them $20,000 to build an 8x10 deck, I don't need to calculate that it's going to be much, much less by the RS means data. But if they say it's going to cost them $1,200, then I know I have to calculate that because that's a much lower value. Legal fees, what are our annual legal fees for the last couple of years? 2018 was about $15,000. 2019 was about $38,000. 2020 so far we're about $8,000, but we also have our big case that has not seen any court time this year, so that's why we had budgeted $40,000, but we're going to see some savings this year based on the reduced amount of court time. Establishing the reserve, what would be the estimated amount of dollars to be collected annually each year for 10 years? So if we're looking at establishing a reserve fund that's equal to 2 years, 2 times our annual expenses, and our annual expenses are about $220,000, we're looking at establishing a reserve of $440,000 at the end of the 10-year mark, which would mean that we would need to allocate $44,000 to those reserves over a 10-year period to get to that point. Another question regarding the existing doubling method not be simpler than calculating the possibility of 6 other individual fees. The way that we calculate doubling now is it's the same method that we're going for in the new system. You calculate what the base permit fee would have been had they followed all the rules and not started early, and then you just double it. So if it cost X amount based on the square footage cost, or it costs Y amount based on the percentage cost, either way, you're just doubling that number. So that's what we already do. That's passed by bylaw from 2011. And then the before and after total fees, 21% increase does sound excessive. The reason being for that 21% is that you're also including the 10% allocation of reserve funds, and you're comparing a 2021 rate to a 2020 rate. So it's actually only about it's really not that much of an increase. You're looking at an increase, I believe it was about 8%. I had the number written down, but it's about 8% or so. And that again is because we are undercharging for houses right now. So we're looking at just sort of bringing those rates back up to a market rate more. We're still lower than all of our neighboring municipalities, with the exception, I believe, of Asphodel Norwood. For some reason, their permit fees seem to be very low, but I think that's because of the volume of new residential construction they have, boosting up those fees. I'm not sure, but to be honest with you, that's just a guess. But our fees in line with, or should align with what the costs are to actually conduct the service. Going through Councillor Landsman's asking a question about what indirect expenses are. So indirect expenses are basically everything that's not a direct expense. A direct expense is something that is tangible, stationary, computers, legal fees, consultants, cell phones, all that sort of stuff, mileage, training, staff wages. Those are all direct expenses. Your indirect expenses are all the non-tangible, almost like operating costs. So heat, hydro, rent, that sort of stuff. In terms of our charges being in compliance with the Act or not, I wouldn't really be able to say. Some municipalities deem indirect expenses as not being in compliance with the Act in the way that we do it now. Some do it that way and think it's fine. So our past practice has always been to charge these indirect expenses to the building department. So I wouldn't really be able to say whether that's in compliance or not, but it's the way that we've done it. It's the way that is proposed to continue doing it. So, and it's fine as long as you allocate for the fees. Past practices on reserve funds are none, which is that historically we have not made any allocations to reserve funds. If there is a deficit, which I believe from around 2009 to 2017, before I took over in 2018, there was always a deficit, minus 1 year, I think, that basically broke even. But otherwise, the deficit was never significant. Like it was in the range of $1,000 to $20,000 or so. But our department has grown, obviously, with the introduction of new services, sewage department, and that sort of thing, and introducing new staff. Our expectations have grown, our customer service levels have changed, and that sort of thing. So the budget has certainly increased. The cost recovery just is there as well. It just needs to be, we just need that reserve fund really as a buffer. Discussing incidental revenues for zoning work orders and that sort of thing. Currently, those go to the administrative budget. They do not go to the building department budget. It's work that's performed by the building department, but it's not money that it's sort of due to our staff resources. I think it's sort of something that's been shouldered by the building department, but it's not necessarily something that has to be done by the building department. It's not a legislative requirement for us, so that's why those fees go elsewhere. Calculating the permit fee at 1.45%, that's 1.45% of their total construction costs. So if it's going to cost them $100,000, then the permit fee would be $1,450. That's 1.45%. So typically, when you're doing construction estimating, you estimate 5 to 10% of your total budget should be allocated for administrative expenses, overheads, preparation of plans, that sort of thing. Question about Selwyn, OSM, and Peterborough, including 10% for reserves. They don't need to. They all have reserve funds that are ample. That's sort of the difference right now, is that we're playing catch up on our reserves. They have reserve funds sufficient enough to cover 2 or more years of expenses. I believe the city has enough reserves to cover about 2.5 years, if I'm not mistaken. OSM is probably sitting more in the 3 to 4 year range, only because they've had some significant developments there that have really boosted their revenues. Getting onto the fee schedule, there's just some questions about volume of work and liability. I think I might have touched on all that stuff already, answering what the question was for a change of use. A transfer permit is where somebody applies for a building permit and then sells the property with the building permit open. In order to change the name from John Smith to Joe Smith, you need to charge for that, because there is actually more work than should be required to do that service. But that's a pretty standard practice. It's also to present them, making sure that they're not changing the permit, making any alterations and that sort of thing, that they're accepting it as it is. I think that was it. I answered those questions already. And that pretty much does it for questions asked in advance. We can go back to you, Your Worship.
Okay, no, thank you very much. And that was the object of this meeting. Thanks for submitting your questions in advance. It's going to save us a lot of time.
You're very quiet right now. I don't know if that's just me or.
Oh, okay. Maybe just turn this little sucker up a bit. How's that? A little better? No?
It's a little bit better.
Okay, I've had techie problems today all day long, so nothing new. Anyway, that was the objective of this meeting today, and the subject will be coming up at, the second meeting in November, is that correct? Okay, so you can ask more questions, you can absorb what we heard today. We had your questions answered. Now, if there's a comment for clarity or a question for clarity, I'll allow that, but I wasn't going to get into to more questions. This was something to solidify that whole report. And I do thank those of you who submitted questions. Heather, go ahead.
Thank you, Your Worship. I do have a question for clarity. Through you, Brian, I've drawn out a little circular reference here that wasn't making sense with me, so I'm hoping you can help inform. So the rationale is ultimately going to this fee structure is to simplify things for customers, our residents. And you had mentioned that oftentimes residents don't know the square footage when they're applying for their permit. So we're going to go to the construction cost, because most of the time they know the construction cost. They've got some sort of budget with the contractor. You also said that about half the time will be required to do some calculations because they've misstated that. So the half that are good, we're good. The half that aren't so good, I'm starting to get a little lost on. So you said if we need to do those calculations, you need to reference the RS data book and reference that to the square footage. But the problem in and of itself is, back to the top, we don't have their square footage. So how is that going to make things easier for residents and for staff?
Certainly. So through Your Worship, we have the square footages. They're on the plans. We can calculate them. The comment I made is that the layperson, the average applicant, homeowner, doesn't know how to read a set of plans to calculate the square footage off their own plans. So we can calculate it. Certainly anybody could calculate it if they knew how to read the drawings. The problem we run into is that, they missed that little piece, or they missed this little piece right now. And if we try to get them to calculate their square footage, it seems to be this overwhelmingly arduous task. And it's like, why can't Brian just do it? You've already got the plans, just do it for me. I don't understand this stuff. And people understand numbers. They understand it's going to cost me $500,000 to build. The one caveat, which I will say honestly, is that yes, if they do underrepresent the number, then what ends up happening is that we will calculate the permit fee based on the square footages. And if it ends up being a higher number, then what will happen is that we just end up coming back to them for a top up, basically. So if they say it's going to cost me $300,000 to build, and we calculate it at $450,000 change, then they would have already paid based on a $300,000 permit, because they're required to submit that money when they submit the application, and we'll have mechanisms for that. just like every other municipality does currently. And then when we calculate the permit fee during the plans review, it'll say, oh, no, you're actually short. You owe us a top up. Oh, pay the top up when you come and pick up your permit. But at least we've collected some revenue as opposed to the mechanism we have now, where we've collected no revenue. So.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that clarification. I have one more question, this time related to the reserves. You had mentioned that previously the deficit that the department would range, anywhere from $1,000 to $20,000. And I understand that the department's changed, it's grown, and now, we're looking at needing to have some reserves. I'm wondering though, if you referenced the budgetary review of $364,000 being a year, plus or minus, why we think that going from zero reserves to a 2-year reserve makes sense at that amount of money, when historically it's only been $1,000 to $20,000 over the last five to 7 years. Could we not aim to have the same kind of increase, like that same $14.50 per square foot, but with a goal to have that like a 1-year reserve, and it only takes us 5 years to get there as opposed to 10? I think I'm mathing that out correctly.
Now, is that a new question, Heather? Did you submit that before, or no? This is a brand new question.
I think it's a question
clarification
for clarity on the
reserves. Yeah.
Okay,
yeah.
Go ahead, Brian.
So just in terms of the logistics of calculating reserve fund allocations, we were proposing a 20-year recovery, a 20-year allocation. So I know Councillor Mohar or Deputy Mayor Mohar's question was about a 10-year number, but that our proposal was a 20-year to get 2 years worth of reserves. If you did 1 year over 10 years, then that's going to be the same rate. So it really wouldn't change anything. I think there is value in considering whether you want 1 year of reserve and you take 20 years to get there. That's worth consideration. Certainly, it's just a proposal that I've made in terms of setting the rate at 10% to get to 2 years at 20 years, over 20 years. So definitely something that can be discussed in the November 17th. I'll probably leave the presentation the way that it is as proposed, but it can certainly be debated then. And then the only other thing that I would say that in terms of not having a reserve fund is very, very risky. As we'll probably find out this year, we're going to be in a deficit this year, not having sufficient reserves to cover our expenses based on reduced revenue from COVID. So if we had reserve, we could have weathered that storm without affecting the tax base.
Sure, I understand.
Reserves
Thank you.
are always a good thing. Mm-hmm. Okay, that's great. I think this was a good way to do things. It saved a lot of time at our last meeting and the second meeting in November. You can pile more questions out and everyone can hear them. Did I see your hand? Just a quickie, Carl.
Yeah, a couple of clarity questions. It has to do with the reserve again. I guess my question is similar to Heather's regarding the amount of reserve. And that is, if we are into a recession where there's little or no building, surely it wouldn't take us 2 years to be able to react to that new reality. We would be able to reduce our expenses a lot quicker than that. That's just a comment, but I guess that on the 16th, that will be probably one of my considerations. And the other one was clarity on the doubling of the fee if no permit is requested. Did I hear you right, Brian, that you're still planning to double it, but these other miscellaneous fees could be on top of the doubling? Is that correct?
Which miscellaneous fees?
The 6 miscellaneous fees, like order to comply, the stop work order.
Oh, those are separate fees, totally different line items. Yeah.
Okay, so the no permit would still be just doubled.
Yes.
Double.
Plus whatever else has to apply.
Yeah, like in the worst case scenario, if we had to issue orders on top of, because like an order to comply or something like that, the first step in enforcement is obviously a friendly conversation, like, hey, come in and get a building permit. And I've got a number of those conversations in the back of my mind right now about various projects in the township that have started without permits, when they come in for their permit, we just double it. We wouldn't want to get to the point of issuing orders. If we have to issue an order, then that's just a mechanism for cost recovery for that order.
Okay, that was it.
Good. Thank you, Carl. Brian, you put a lot of work into this. It was very, very, very thorough, and I think we all thank you for that. More questions, please save them up if there's any confusion at all for the second meeting in November. And this meeting here saved us a lot of time at our last meeting, so that's a good, efficient way to do things. Martina, did you want any closing comment before we go?
No, not too much. Yeah, Brian has put a lot of time and effort into this project, and we've reviewed it multiple times and run different scenarios to see how the reserves would work and how these different fee calculations would impact the township, whether we included the reserve balance or we removed it. So I think Brian's done a good job on figuring this all out. And I do echo his comments that having reserves are very important. We haven't had them for the building department in the past, and then we've had to adjust the tax rate to make up the difference. Whereas if we had reserves, then we could ensure that cost recovery is always available to the township. So that's just a nice way to make sure that expenses are being covered. I know there was a comment about reducing expenses in the case of a recession. That's not always as easy as it seems, because some expenses are pretty fixed in place and they're just needed to run the department in general. So we would be able to potentially reduce some expenses, but the vast majority of the expenses are pretty static. And so it would be quite difficult to reduce them, things like heat, hydro, overhead, staffing costs. You wouldn't want to let a staff member go because of one bad year. You'd want to be able to carry that forward and not lose all that investment you put into that staff member. So just things to
Okay,
consider.
we're going to wrap it up. I see your mouth moving, Carl, but I'm not hearing you.
I'm sure Brian could drive a snowplow.
Yeah, we'll look at that. We'll look at that. Okay, well, thank you very much, Brian. Great job. And that certainly was an efficient way of doing things here today. We have no closed session. Confirming bylaw 2020-59. A motion, please. Sheila, seconded by Carl. All in favor? All opposed? That motion is approved. And a motion to adjourn, please. Tom and Heather, all in favor? All opposed? That motion is approved. The meeting is adjourned. Thank you, everyone out there, for joining us. More information on the subject will be coming up on our second meeting of November. Thank you all very much. Have a great weekend, and everyone, please stay safe. Goodbye.
Thank you.